All right. Thank you everyone for being here in person and for those who are joining us via the webinar. If you are here in person, you probably noticed, but there are snacks in the back, and if you need to use a restroom, you can do so if you exit the auditorium and then go to the left. There's also some drinking fountains. Feel free to, if you need to, get up and refresh yourself, get food, get water at any point during the presentation. My name is Zainab, and I am the program coordinator for the Friends of Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. And the Friends' mission is to support the protection, restoration, and conservation of the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument through service, advocacy, and education. Before we begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that what we call the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument and surrounding area has been the ancestral lands of Native tribes since time immemorial, including the Takelma, Shasta, Letgawa, Cayuse, Cow Creek, Umpqua, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Modoc. All Native people in what is now known as Ashland endured genocide, forest removal, and broken treaties with the U.S. Their living descendants are now enrolled across several of Oregon's federally recognized tribes. I do ask for forgiveness if I have left out a tribal group, and I encourage each of you to visit the tribal websites to hear Native people's history in their own words. In addition to that acknowledgement, I would also like to ask you to support Indigenous communities by taking action. I have some action items here to think about and act on. First, we can give land back to tribes. If this is something that you are interested in learning more about, the website for the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde has information. We can protect the environment and salmon. Tribal cultures depend on them. We can insist that the United States respect tribal sovereignty and uphold its trust responsibility to tribes, which includes appropriate levels of federal funding to support tribal needs. Many promises to tribal nations still need to be kept. We can elect officials that understand tribal governments, relationships, and laws. We can invest in tribal economies in many ways. And we can challenge and reject all stereotypes about Indigenous people. We can insist that our children and grandchildren and family members are taught accurate information about histories, cultures, and contemporary lives of Indigenous peoples in our school system. And we can also inform ourselves about issues impacting Indigenous communities and speak up. Finally, we can educate ourselves about the atrocities committed against Native people in Oregon and the entire United States, but also about the rich and unique tribal cultures that are here. A good place to start is simply going to a tribe's website and start learning about their histories. Thank you. And today we are here to envision a reconnected wild landscape over, under, and through Interstate 5 in Southern Oregon. The Mariposa Wildlife Overcrossing on Interstate 5 will be the crown jewel in what could become a network of wildlife crossings stretching along the interstate between the city of Ashland and the Oregon-California border. Interstate 5 and the approximately 17,000 vehicles it supports daily along this route have severed ecological connections between coastal and inland ecosystems for decades, putting at risk one of the most diverse wildlife assemblages in the nation, including the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. The monument's unique designation for protection due to its biodiversity makes the location particularly appropriate. Today, we will learn what a network of wildlife crossings might look like, including building new bridges, retrofitting existing bridges, and improving culverts, and how these changes would improve life for a diverse array of wildlife species and create a safer and more enjoyable future for the traveling public. And our two presenters today are Dr. Karen Mauger and Dr. Jack Williams. Karen Mauger, PhD, is an associate professor of environmental science, policy, and sustainability and biology at SOU. She is a wildlife ecologist focused on the management and conservation and wildlife conservation of mammals. Much of her research has focused on caribou population dynamics, genetic diversity, and connectivity. Here in Southern Oregon, her focus is on how roads affect connectivity for a diversity of species. She loves to work with students in the field using methods such as camera trapping, small mammal live trapping, and natural history observation. And Jack Williams, PhD, is the Emeritus Senior Scientist for Trout Unlimited and co-coordinator of the Southern Oregon Wildlife Crossing Coalition. He also serves on the board of directors for the Rogue River Watershed Council. Since his retirement from Trout Unlimited, most of Jack's work has focused on conservation projects in Southern Oregon, including efforts to restore ecological connectivity in and around the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. His dogs, energetic Springer Spaniels, also keep him busy with field trials around the West. Once the presentation has finished, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, so please hold your questions until the end. For those attending online, please use the Q&A feature of the webinar. And yes, I will stop talking now. I will get to what you all came here for.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the kind introductions, and appreciate the invitation from the Friends Group for being here today. In case you didn't know, I'm Jack. Karen's right over here, and we'll be splitting up the talk. So I'll talk for a bit, and then turn it over to Karen, and Karen can show you the neat little videos of the animals racing along their habitats and things like that. It's always so cool. So yeah, I appreciate everybody coming. I appreciate the support for the monument. And the area we're going to be talking about is Interstate 5 from the city of Ashland down to the California border, about a 14-mile project area. And the Mariposa site is in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. Some of the other places we'll be talking about are in the monument as well, but it's a very interesting subject area, and a very positive story I think we have to share. Like a lot of things and a lot of big projects, there's all kinds of people to thank and to acknowledge. It's hard to know kind of where to start in doing this, but I've got to acknowledge Amy Amrine, who's my co-coordinator, and she's probably watching today. Dan Roberts with ODOT. ODOT has obviously been a huge partner of ours, Oregon Department of Transportation. Tim Gresseth, he's the executive director of the Oregon Wildlife Foundation. And our wildlife crossing group would have been in sad situation from the very beginning, except that Tim agreed to be our financial sponsor. So we didn't end up creating a new 501c3 organization. So Tim has been front and center in a lot of our work. And then, of course, Karen and her research assistant, Sean Johnson, here at SOU as well. And then we have a lot of cool videos and other things if you want to see it at that my Oregon Wildlife Foundation, OWF should be, at .org SOWCC. Okay, well, I think all of you know that the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument is an area of high biological diversity. In fact, it's the only national monument so declared because of its biodiversity. And why is that? Well, some unique geology, obviously diverse habitats plays a critical role, and this idea of ecological connections. The monument is sort of a biological crossroads between, you know, to the west, the Coast Range, the Klamath System, the Cascades, over to the high desert. It's sort of this area in between all of those. And largely because the Siskiyou Mountains are running east and west, while almost all the other mountain ranges are running north and south. So the Siskiyou Summit area, the monument itself in this kind of amazing crossroads of ecological connectivity. And I-5, you know what, when you look at it at a landscape scale, I-5 is really a very narrow, you know, line through the ecosystem, you wouldn't think it would be that big of a deal. But when you think of 17,000 vehicles per day, you think of all the trucks and the gears going up and down the mountains, all the noise, the lights, the vibration, it's a huge barrier for wildlife. A lot of the wildlife, frankly, when they get close here, they just divert away from it and don't even attempt to cross it. So it's a huge barrier for wildlife of all sorts. Now, the human and animal component is displayed just briefly in this about 4-year carcass total from ODOT, sort of our collision map in this area. Again, city of Ashland would be at the very top, and at the very bottom would be the California border. The Mariposa site that we'll be talking a lot about tonight is at about milepost 1.7, so about a little over 1.5 miles north of the California-Oregon border. And that's in this kind of red zone in terms of collisions. But as you can see, it's not all red. It's a variety of things. And part of that has to do with the topography around the interstate. Part of it has to do with a variety of factors that as I think you'll see. And I think probably all of us that have had a deer or other large animal or even small animal dart out in front of us while we're driving, that's a very, very traumatic situation. And part of what we're trying to do is improve not only the lives for the animals, but the lives of the traveling public as well. I should also point out that most wildlife vehicle collisions are undocumented. A lot of the estimates are that at least for just the large animals themselves, things like deer and elk or bear, probably 2 or 3 times is the actual number that's hit and killed, rather than that's the number that's actually documented. And of course, you add small animals into that scheme and it goes off the charts. So the actual number of animals killed is probably fairly high. Now, what are we trying to help in the way of wildlife? Well, this project, particularly the Mariposa crossing, but really this whole idea of a network of wildlife crossings from the city of Ashland down to the California border, we're trying to help a lot of species because it's a biodiverse area. It's everything from pollinators to birds, mountain quail, rare species like fisher and ringtail, or big species like the black-tailed deer and elk, or black bear or cougar. So a wide variety of species that we're trying to benefit here. It's a tough place, but as we see, or as we will see, wildlife are amazing in their ability to find ways to get from one place to another. I don't know if it's more amazing that a lot of them will approach the freeway and divert off just because of all the noise and sound, or the fact that some will find a way to get across, or maybe get under, or find a bridge that crosses and follow that bridge, or even a railroad crossing. So these were our sites, 8 sites that we initially looked at. In fact, Charlie Shells with BLM helped us find these sites. Then Karen and her crew at SOU started monitoring them with Charlie back in 2021, something like that, a while back. Starting up at the top with Neal Creek, you may be familiar with where all of these sites are, but Neal Creek in particular on I-5, there's a box culvert that the creek runs through. It's a pretty poor passage for fish. There are steelhead and even occasionally coho that get up there. ODOT initially thought about building a whole new bridge system that would take out those culverts, allow the stream to flow naturally under the interstate. That would be a very expensive, very difficult option. But there may be things that we could actually do in the existing bridge to improve wildlife passage. Site 2, Barren Creek. This was our second highest priority for an overcrossing site to build a new overcrossing site. So it would probably be a lot less expensive than Mariposa because if nothing else, the freeway is closer together there. When we show Mariposa, you'll see that there's a big median. The lanes are actually in an uneven elevations, and there's a lot of complexity there. Wall Creek, Site 3 Wall Creek, and the railroad bridge. I think Karen will probably show some videos of animals crossing that railroad bridge. It's kind of amazing. It's also a fairly narrow or not too long of a bridge that a lot of animals use. The Mount Ashland exit site at about milepost 6. We'll look at, I'll actually have some slides, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Siskiyou Summit has a nice culvert that goes under the freeway. Bear Gulch has also one of the larger culverts. Unfortunately, the freeway is so wide down there that those culverts are about 600 or 700 feet long. And even though they're straight, if you can imagine a culvert that say has a 5 foot or a 6 or 7 foot diameter, and you're trying to get to the other side, just a little point of light. But yet some animals do it, which is always kind of amazing. Mariposa Preserve is our big overcrossing site, but there's also a culvert there that animals use. And then there's couple of smaller culverts way down by the California border. So all of this area is potentially important and could comprise this network of crossings that we like to think about. A few little mileposts on the Mariposa crossing, and to give you a little bit more detail of where we are. I mentioned that I'm the co-coordinator of the Southern Oregon Wildlife Crossing Coalition. We formed this group in 2021. I should acknowledge the initial core group that met to kick this idea around. Maya Black, Michael Parker from SOU, Pepper Trail from the Audubon Society, and Dave Willis from Soda Mountain Wilderness Council. And I met at actually Caldera, not too far from here, and just another one of those interesting ideas that comes from drinking beer around with good friends. Mentioned Oregon Wildlife Foundation as our fiscal sponsor. Amy Amrine has done a great job with fundraising. She's kind of the lead on that effort. All the trail cams and wildlife monitoring begins. We did a conceptual design and feasibility study that was completed in November of 2022 that looked at all of those 8 feasibility sites. And then for a variety of reasons, we chose the Mariposa site as our top priority for actually building a wildlife crossing. The reason for that, there's several fold. One is, of course, it's in the monument, so it'd be a high priority for reconnecting the monument. It's also an area of high biodiversity compared to the other sites we looked at. And I think Karen will probably talk a little bit more about that. In 2023, ODOT begins the design work and geoengineering work for the Mariposa Overcrossing. In fact, if you drive that area at, again, about milepost 1.7, you can see some land disturbance on the sides, and that's where ODOT had done their geotechnical drilling to study soils and substrates and so forth. We did apply initially under the Infrastructure Act, the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program, for money for this, for the big construction grant in 2023. We were not successful, but Federal Highways told us, great application, we just ran out of money, resubmit next year. So that's what we did. And in December of last year, ODOT was awarded $33 million for constructing the Mariposa Overcrossing site. We did run into, as many people did, some temporary funds that were frozen by the administration, but then have since been released. And ODOT actually, anytime I think they have a project over about 25 million, they go through what's called a value engineering process. This, they brought in a new crew, essentially new eyes on the project as looking at ways to reduce costs. And they found a number of ways to reduce the costs of the Mariposa Overcrossing project to the tune of probably over $10 million. a lot of cost savings. Um, Last year or this year, we also developed the Mount Ashland project, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And we hope for groundbreaking and construction of the Mariposa site either next year or in 2027. It would all be constructed, by the way, in a single season. So it wouldn't be terribly disruptive, I don't think, from that perspective. A little bit more detail on this. This is a big overcrossing, about 200 feet wide, about 700 feet long. I don't think the final design is actually completed yet. These are some ODOT renderings of what that would look like. But 200 feet wide is pretty big. That's pretty wide. And that gives us the opportunity to try to create a variety of habitats for different species. Try to have some areas that are fairly densely vegetated with large wood, boulders, and things that animals can get through. Some other areas that are going to be more open sighting that maybe animals like deer or elk will like to use a little bit better. Fencing is included about 2.5 miles, we think, on each side, that which will dip us a little bit into California. And total cost will probably actually run in that $20 to $28 million when it's all said and done. So a little bit less, or quite a bit less than what we thought. And this would be the first overcrossing, wildlife overcrossing constructed on I-5. You may have heard of things like the Wallace-Annenberg wildlife crossing. If y'all heard of that, that's an amazing crossing. It's on 101 in Southern California. That's actually under construction as well. Very, very cool stuff. So anyway, that's the Mariposa site. I did want to also talk a little bit about another project, a very different kind of project, and it's the Mount Ashland Exit Project, something that we've just been developing this year. Same partners, same crew of people. Here's a schematic and overhead, kind of a Google Earth perspective of that exit. It's kind of a mess when you look at it, right? It looks fairly complex. However, the highway under the interstate is fairly lightly traveled over to Callahan's and back down. This is obviously the exit to Mount Ashland. The arrow's pointing towards the bridges. I wanted to show you. So here's the south embankment under those bridges. So the freeway is passing overhead on the bridges. You can see there's actually, I think, 4 deer in that photo. And there's a good area that they can cross underneath the interstate. This is one of these areas that we looked at, had some initial data on the trail cameras and things, and we wondered, could we improve this for wildlife? I'll admit these guys, it doesn't look like they're exactly stressed out. And when you see deer in this area, they don't seem to be stressed out. In fact, at our field trip last week, there was a deer just curled up under one of these, under one of the bridges. So it's kind of amazing. But nonetheless, we think we might be able to do some things that could improve wildlife's ability to use this site. And maybe not only the number of deer, but maybe number of species, different kinds of species, because this is it's a higher elevation than Mariposa. It's a very different system, but we could get some interesting critters going back and forth through that. This is a little bit of an ODOT conceptual and aerial view looking down at the bridges, and you can see there's what we're proposing is what we call a wildlife bench. This would be about 700 feet long, so it'd go under those bridges and would be maybe about 8 feet wide, and then we would have a partial screen of plantings, boulders, large wood on part of the bench, between the bench and the highway. The other particularly interesting point of this project is the SOU connection. And what we're hoping here is to learn if we're actually doing the right things or not, and then modify our project to improve it. So we've got monitoring proposed for 1 year before construction, during construction, and 1 year afterwards. So we'll be able to tell if our work has actually helped wildlife passage, and if we should duplicate it on the other side. or whether we should just leave it alone. So that'll be an interesting project, I think. And there's another little ODOT kind of rendition of what that might look like going underneath the freeway. A little bit different kind of project, a little cheaper project too. A budget on this of about 360,000 versus about 28 million for the big overcrossing project at Mariposa. But we think we have a good chance of getting funding, and if so, we'd probably start the monitoring this year actually, and do the construction work for the south embankment in a couple of months in over 2026. And then do more monitoring and see what the animals tell us about how they like what work we've done. So that's a quick view of the Mariposa and the Mount Ashland exit projects, just to give you a feel for the kinds of things that we're looking at, big things, small things. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Karen and have at it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Karen Mager. I'm dealing with a little bit of laryngitis this week, so I'm going to do my best to project. But Jack has told you this really inspiring story of how we started with this idea less than 5 years ago of investigating ways to provide better passage across I-5 for wildlife that's really yielded a lot of results, right? We have a couple construction projects in the work. And the goal of this is to really improve wildlife passage and motorist safety. But I'm a scientist and we need data to know if that actually works. So my half of the talk is going to be looking at how we'll actually know if these wildlife crossings are working and the types of monitoring that we're doing to discover that. So we have been monitoring sites along I-5 since 2021 using primarily camera traps. And I'll be talking about those methods a little bit more in a couple minutes. And the big question we've been asking is just how do these larger bodied terrestrial wildlife, so this is mostly mammals, but also think of things like wild turkeys, you know, they can't fly across Interstate 5 probably all the way. How do they use the I-5 corridor and its existing infrastructure already, including those feasibility sites that Jack talked about? And this work really started out as an effort to kind of inform our planning and design of wildlife crossing structures and improvements in the future. We know that wildlife vehicle collisions are common, as Jack showed you with this map. But beyond the map, we've experienced it ourselves. So my first interaction with this group was on a little tour of the highway where we ran into this bear that had recently been killed and was lying on the side of the highway. And I think that was really a call to action for many of us, seeing that bear. In collecting our data, we've also discovered and seen evidence of the ways that the highway really influences wildlife. So I'm going to play this video. This is recorded at the only overpass at that railroad bridge, and you can see these deer thinking about using it to cross the highway. So obviously, like the extreme noise that these animals are experiencing is deterring them from passing, even in the one place that provides safe passage over the highway. It's this open, exposed railroad bridge that's very loud. And so our monitoring has helped to inform the choice of these overpasses and underpass improvements that we want to do. And the goal is that in the future, we're going to have this deer are going to experience the highway this way, right? The picture to the right is kind of a deer's eye view of what it might experience as it's trying to cross the Mariposa overpass. And we're hoping to monitor the effectiveness of those. So as I mentioned, we started out really exploratory, kind of trying to understand the landscape. And as the Mariposa overpass has been funded, we've moved towards more targeted monitoring efforts. The ways we monitor the highway, we use camera traps, also known as trail cams or game cams. You may be familiar with these. There's that image up there of one in a lockbox. And these use an usually an infrared sensor to detect motion and then trigger photos or videos of the animals that walk across. We've got a bunch of these cameras set up and we go out and do field work regularly. One of the big goals of this is actually education and outreach as well. And in my role as a professor here at SOU, I'm typically able to get 50 to 60 students out in the field every year to our field sites learning about these methods. And we've employed or had capstone students, 18 students so far working on this project. So really good opportunity to do this kind of field work that you see here. This is a good time for me to acknowledge two of my most important collaborators on this fieldwork as well. Sean Johnson, my research assistant, who does most of the day-to-day work on this project at this point, really incredible researcher who just graduated from SOU last year. And Charlie Shells, the retired ecologist from the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, who really kicked off this effort, and I jumped on the bandwagon and just got lucky. With these cameras, we get images such as the one right here. This is one of my favorite images. It's a mama bobcat and 3 little kittens, and she's showing them how to cross the highway through a culvert. These images show us not only the species that are present, but we can get a sense of age, of group structure, and they have information you probably can't quite see on the bottom on temperature, date, time of day, and things like that. Once we have these images on an SD card, that's when the real work begins. And it's the less exciting part of the work, but it needs to be done. We've collected about 1.4 million image files so far, and someone needs to go through all of them. And so I've been really lucky to partner with Dr. Bernie Bosco in our computer science department here to develop an AI research pipeline where we're able to use a program called Mega Detector. It actually looks at all the images and draws a box around anything it thinks is an animal. So here's a really cool example of 2 elk sparring during the rut. And you can see that Mega Detector has found the elk and drawn these little boxes around them. This is hugely helpful to us because wind triggers our cameras a lot, and only like 2 to 5% of our images actually have an animal in them. So once we've done this, we can just focus on those pictures that have an animal. And to date, out of those 1.4 million, we've detected about 15,000 animals, just to give you a sense of the work. Okay, that's as much as I'll say about research methods. Let's get to looking at some of the things we've discovered about wildlife along I-5. So here's a little bit of a different map to look at this study area. You don't see those sites that Jack mentioned, although we have cameras at many of them, but all of these dots represent locations where we have cameras. That little star in the upper left is Ashland, where we are now, just for reference. And you can see how the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument in green crosses the highway in this project area. And so that importance of connectivity across the highway within the monument. Okay, so this is where our cameras are. And here's my first data figure. It's probably completely overwhelming, but I'm going to explain it. So along the y-axis there, from top to bottom, is basically a list of our cameras from north to south. So from the top, you're close to Ashland, down to the bottom, you're close to California. And then along the x-axis there, we have what we call our capture rate. So that's kind of the number of animals per 100 days detected at each of these cameras. So the length of the bar tells you the number of animals detected. And then the colors represent different species. So first of all, you can see those light gray bars are all deer. No surprise there. Deer are most abundant at most of our locations. And then the other colors represent other species. So that kind of light green that you're seeing is actually, we get a lot of gray fox. Okay, so there's some patterns I'd love you to notice in this. And most significantly, this line that I'm drawing right here is the location of the actual Siskiyou summit, the highest elevation along I-5. So the cameras above it are north of the summit and the cameras below it are south of the summit. And you just see a lot more colors south of the summit, right? We consistently detect a higher diversity of species at our cameras on the south side of the summit. And this was one of the things that was our impetus for really developing a site on the south side where the monument is and where the preserve, the Mariposa overpass will be. Okay, so we're going to dig a little bit more into some of what we found beyond these colored bars. I want to talk first about what we've discovered at the proposed wildlife overcrossing site. And so this in the bottom right is a picture of kind of what it looks like right now as an animal to be standing on one side of the Mariposa overpass site looking across the highway. And this map shows where it will span the highway. And one of the first things we did when ODOT designed this and proposed it for the wildlife crossing program was to set up some cameras essentially at the on-ramps of the overpass. Where will these animals have to walk if they're going to get on the overpass in the future, and who's using it already? So we have 2 cameras on each side of the highway there, and kind of a laundry list of species that we've detected there. We've detected most of the species that you'd expect in the area, with the exceptions of some of our more rare species. And just recently, we had our first detection of mountain lions at the site, which was really exciting. So this is a cougar that was seen on the west side of the highway and on the east side of the highway. Interestingly, these were seen 6 days apart, the exact same time of day. It's hard to know if it's the exact same mountain lion that actually successfully crossed the road or if it's 2 different ones. But we're getting mountain lions at this site, which is really exciting. We've also been doing monitoring for the Mount Ashland exit. This was done in the past by Charlie Shells primarily. And so I thought since we talked about Mount Ashland, I'd show some evidence of what we found there. On the west side, we've seen fewer species here. And this side was only monitored for 43 days, so we didn't see much. But on the east side that was monitored a little bit longer, you can see just how prevalent deer are here. So many deer. We did also pick up a few bears and coyotes and some other species. Jack touched on this, but this aims to really improve the habitat connections for deer that are already walking through forested areas near the highway. So there's this kind of forested fringe along the highway there that deer seem to use a lot. And we've captured some exciting interactions, like this deer running through the snow, followed by a coyote. All right. Oh, goodness. There we go. We have been monitoring this area since late 2021. Not every camera continuously, but we have some cameras that have been out for about 3 years of total data collection. And this has shown us just how important it is to do long-term monitoring in order to detect the suite of species that we find in this area, including rare species. So this graph here looks at the total, what we call trap nights. Think of this as the days that our camera is active, right? So if the camera's battery dies, it's not active. Or if its SD card is full, it's not active. You can see that our cameras that have been out the longest have been active for about 1,200 days, and some have been active for only 50 or 60. And you can see along the y-axis there the number of species we're detecting. And that curve, it starts leveling off, but it just keeps going up, right? The more time we're monitoring, the more we're catching additional species. And some of those rare species are so important to detect because they're one of the reasons that we're doing these projects. So ringtail, for example, is a relative of the raccoon. I don't know how many of you have seen it. They've got a huge raccoon tail, but it's attached to a body about the size of a muskrat. So they're really fun looking. We've captured them at several locations, including the railroad bridge and the Siskiyou Summit and in Bear Gulch. This is one of the species that's on the Oregon Conservation Strategy list as a species of concern, and that we really hope we can improve its connectivity through some of these wildlife overpasses. The other Oregon Conservation Strategy species, of course, is the Pacific fisher. A really important forest carnivore that we have a lot of conservation concerns about. We have been very happy to detect this at several sites along the highway, including to the north in Barron Creek. That's where this little juvenile is kind of like galloping around. And at 3 sites to the south. And one thing I want you to note about those sites to the south is that the 2 southernmost ones are each just right next to where the wildlife crossing will be. The Mariposa overpass is going to be right in between those 2 lower dots. So one of the stated goals of the Oregon Conservation Strategy is to help fisher cross the highway. And this is some of the things that we're trying to do. And then another rare species, a lot of people don't know about. This one's so cute, the spotted skunk. It's a skunk that's like 1/5 of the size of a normal skunk, maybe even less. And we have detected several of them right in the project area close to the Mariposa Preserve. Okay, another thing we wanted to understand, of course, was highway crossing behaviors. How are wildlife actually crossing the highway right now? So we've talked about this railroad bridge being the one overpass over the highway. We've seen black bears, including this mama with cub, lots of deer, bobcats. Here's a cougar crossing the highway over that railroad bridge, and a lot of gray fox. And then we've also been monitoring a number of highway culverts that go under the highway. And so we see a ton of bobcats using these culverts. Here's one that has been doing some actually scent marking and things like that and some other videos. This was exciting. We've had one and only one bear cross the highway using a culvert. This is that big culvert Jack was talking about. And we got a video of it coming out of the other side as well. So again, only one event. It is not an ideal way for a bear to cross the highway. And in fact, culverts are designed for water, right? Not for wildlife. So you can see this bobcat attempting to use the culvert as it's in its flood condition. And that's a very wet bobcat. The animals that use these culverts absolutely fascinate me. And so it's one of the places I started digging into the data, and we've started thinking about setting up some additional experiments in the future. Because we think some animals are using these culverts habitually as travel routes and habitat, whereas others maybe just once in a while if they need to cross the highway. Bobcats are one of those species that seem to use these culverts really habitually. And so there are 3 culverts that we've been monitoring where we have images both inside the culvert and in nearby habitats. And so the blue bars are inside the culvert and the orange are in nearby habitats. And you can see that bobcats use the insides of the culverts more often than they use the outsides of the culverts. I mean, that's not really true. They have to get to the culvert somewhere, but we're detecting them a lot more inside the culvert than we are in the nearby habitats. We've seen the same with striped skunks, or maybe just one skunk. It could be just one skunk that really likes this culvert. You can see just how often we're detecting this skunk inside this culvert compared to some of the habitats nearby. And but we also have other species using culverts who are clearly using them just once in a while, perhaps when they get kind of desperate to cross the highway. So black bears have only been detected that one time in that one culvert, and we see them frequently at cameras nearby. And gray foxes, similarly, we've seen them use the culverts, but they're much more commonly detected outside of the culverts. So that's something we want to continue to monitor. Okay, so that's some of my fun data about what's happening along the highway. And I want to turn now to kind of laying out our vision for how we might monitor this into the future as we're actually seeing all of this restoration activity happening. And the first thing to think about is that because we're monitoring a biodiversity hotspot, a monument set aside by Congress for the protection of biodiversity, we want to do biodiversity monitoring. Now, this is a little different than some of the monitoring that sometimes happens for other wildlife crossings. For example, you can imagine there are wildlife crossings that are located in places of really important migration routes for a particular species, like mule deer or elk or antelope. And you might want to focus on tracking the movements of that species across the highway. That would be great here, but it's expensive. We don't have the data, and we're trying to help a lot of species anyway. We don't have a single migration we're targeting. So our goal going forward is to use camera traps and other tools to try to detect the species using the area. And we hope that as an outcome of all these improvements we're seeing along the highway, we're going to see increases in diversity of species using these sites, like Jack talked about with the Mount Ashland exit. What if we could create a habitat that's appealing to things like bobcats and fishers and ringtail that want to cross the highway? We're hoping to detect shifts in behavior, right? So road crossing behavior and avoidance, we hope will change as species find ways to comfortably cross the highway. Obviously, reducing wildlife vehicle collisions is a really important thing that we want to monitor, and ODOT will be taking the lead on that. We're really excited to try to document highway crossings, especially by fisher and ringtail, those Oregon conservation species, and to see evidence that they're actually using these structures to cross the highway in the future. And then another thing we haven't talked about it as much, but is really important, is that we want to improve genetic connections between species across the highway. And I wish our colleague Charlie Shells had this great cartoon he showed of bears stuck on the opposite side of the highway, talking about how they have to find a way across if they want to pair up and mate. But that's the reality for some of these species, is that the highway is a real barrier to finding mates and to promoting genetic exchange. And that's not only large mammals, that's things like small mammals that will have a hard time crossing the highway, or even invertebrates that might have a hard time crossing the highway, even flying ones. So one of the things about what we're doing that's really unique and exciting, actually, is that we're monitoring these sites both before and after construction. Pre and post-construction monitoring of wildlife crossing structures is actually really rare. There's not a lot of pre-construction monitoring that happens, and when it does, it's often just to get to the point of getting support, and then they do a completely different type of monitoring afterwards. So we're really trying to set this up that we can make comparisons. And that's really in keeping with the source of funding from the federal government for this Mariposa overpass. It was funded by the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program. And that word pilot program is important because it acknowledges that we're trying something out and hoping to learn from it. So the big goal of that program is to reduce these wildlife vehicle collisions, but secondary goals are to build some knowledge of how to do this thing, what works, what doesn't, and start to develop some best practices so that wildlife crossings hopefully can be built into construction planning more broadly in the future. So our plan to monitor the Mariposa overpass uses something called a BACI design. Just work with me as I break that down for a minute. It stands for Before After Control Impact. So we have this little timeline along the bottom. We started monitoring 2021 so that we'll have about 5 to 6 solid years of pre-construction monitoring data before the overpass is built. And then we're proposing to monitor it for at least 5 years after, hopefully more, to understand how wildlife are using it as they're acclimating and discovering and getting used to this structure. But we're not only going to monitor the overpass itself and the fence lines running along it. That's going to be very important. We're also going to monitor areas that aren't being impacted by these improvements. And those are control areas. Just like you might have a control treatment in a lab experiment, our control areas are areas that are not seeing any wildlife improvement. And the really cool thing about this type of a monitoring program is that you can compare how much change has happened before and after in the control areas and compare that to the change before and after in the impact areas. And of course, what we hope is that we're going to see a much greater amount of change in these impact areas, in how much species are using it, in the diversity of species using it, in the whole structure of the ecological community in the area, and in these wildlife vehicle collisions. So we've been working with ODOT, the Southern Oregon Wildlife Crossing broadly, to kind of design this big fun experiment on the landscape to understand the effectiveness of the Mariposa overpass. And oh gosh, I've got so many other ideas. If anyone wants to hand me like a couple $1 million, I'll add even more. Of course, we're going to have cameras on the overpass to see which animals are actually using the bridge itself. These fence lines here, there's going to be 2.5 miles of fence line to the north and to the south. And there will be little structures along it called jump outs. This means if an animal gets stuck on the wrong side of the fence and it's next to the highway trying to find a way out, that it's going to regularly find these things where it can kind of climb a hill and jump out to safety on either side. But it's much harder to get from the safe side into the highway. So we'll be monitoring which animals are using those jump outs. The fencing is also going to be built to intersect these culverts and hopefully not block them, because some animals that hit those fences and start moving towards the overpass might choose to use a culvert instead. And then I'm hoping to set up some live traps for small mammals to see what kinds of voles and shrews and things are using the bridge, to do some DNA sampling, and to maybe even do some invertebrate surveys of rare pollinators that might be using these bridges and all of the habitat created on them. Getting close to the end here, I want to at least briefly loop back to what Jack talked about with our plan for monitoring the Mount Ashland exit. It's similar on a much smaller scale than what we just talked about with Mariposa, but again, we're at least going to start with an impact area, that south bench that we'll be improving, and a control area on the other side. And we're going to be monitoring both sides before construction and after construction. And so it's that same backy design, right? Do we see an increase in diversity over time, that side that we've improved or not? But the really cool thing about how the monitoring plan and the whole grant was written for this, and big kudos to the Oregon Wildlife Foundation for really championing that, is that they built in adaptive management. So we're actually going to check the data every once in a while and say, are we seeing improvements? Are we seeing any worrying signs that this is actually making things less safe for motorists? Etc. And use that to decide whether to construct a bench on the other side or make improvements or take no action at all. And again, that's kind of contributing to this culture of learning and developing knowledge about how to improve wildlife passage over the highway. So this is just the beginning. It's a very exciting beginning, and I think a more wildly successful first 5 years than any of us could have expected. But as Jack explained, we have a vision for a whole network of wildlife crossings along I-5 that really enable wildlife to move back and forth across this incredibly important area. So Jack mentioned that Barron Creek site to the north. If funding were available in the future, that would be a potential area for a second overpass. I showed you that graph that showed that the north side was a little less diverse than just lots of deer, and that's mostly true, but Barron Creek is an interesting spot. If you look at our data, large mammals are really abundant there. So think like bears, cougars, deer. Bears are very common there. And it's the one place on the north side that we've detected Pacific fisher. So it could end up being a really important location. There's also options to try to work with some culvert replacements or retrofits if the opportunity comes. There are a whole bunch of examples from elsewhere where people have been able to make culverts a lot easier for wildlife to traverse while still allowing them to move water. But the big goal is really just to create a more permeable highway, a safer roadway, a connected Siskiyous, and a model for conservation. And we're going to see where it takes us. So I have a lot of people to acknowledge and thank for the monitoring work. This work has taken a lot of financial support and a lot of hard work. So I want to especially acknowledge my student, Sean Johnson, who's now a research assistant who does a lot of the day-to-day of this project. And all the other students. This list of students are people who've either been paid research assistants or done full year-long capstones on this project in the last 4 years. I mentioned my collaborator, Bernie Bosco, in the computer science department, doing really cool things with wildlife AI, and Charlie Shells, of course, who got this whole thing started. And my part of the project, at least, has received funding from the Wildlife Crossing Coalition, Oregon Wildlife Foundation, SOU's Institute of Applied Sustainability, the Wild Labs Wild Tech Awards, Friends of the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, thank you, the Sloan Foundation, and Bob Given. And we're really grateful for that support. So I want to just, again, especially thank the Friends of the Monument so much for having us here tonight. And I think at this point, Jack and I will take questions.
You both want to go up there and we can take questions from the audience, and then I have some questions on Zoom too that I can read off for you, but if anyone in the audience has questions, raise your hands.
Sure.
I remember reading a paper in the early 2000s that documented genetic diversity in mountain lions on either side of I-5 in Southern California.
Mhm.
as a result of I-5. Do you have any kind of genetic data for this reach of I-5 on any kind of species?
Good question. So on mountain lions, not that I know of. And I know that mountain lions have been one of the big drivers for wildlife crossings in Southern California because of that evidence. Um, I'll be in a call next week with some people talking about fisher genetics. That's something that has been monitored in the area and potentially could be. You may have.
Yeah, we were just last week, in fact, talking to Fish and Wildlife Service about collecting some hair samples. They have some interesting little traps, some baited traps that the animals have to crawl through with some kind of sticky paper that collects hair samples, and we can get their DNA from that. And so that, yeah, so that'd be really cool to find that. You know, we've got populations on both sides. So yeah.
And one more that really interests me there actually is elk. We know we have elk near the wildlife crossing on the west side. We know we're on the east side. They don't show up in those vehicle collision statistics for the area much. And we haven't caught them on many of our cameras close to the road, any of our cameras close to the road. So we're hopeful that they'll start crossing the road and maybe reconnecting a bit more.
Jeff, go ahead.
No.
Oh, yeah. We have one afternoon here, and I think people can hear me close enough, but for people who ask in the audience, if you don't mind just repeating it or summarizing the question, that would be great. What if humans try to use the overpass for camping or walking, etc.? Can they be legally kept off of the wildlife crossing?
That's a good question. I know the Oregon Hunters Association was also, concerned about potential hunter use, and so they're looking at some regulations that would prohibit hunting within 500 feet, I think it is, of the wildlife crossing. I don't think that area, we've talked about the potential for, it's not an area that's really easily accessible like a few of the other sites are. And, I'm not, you never know, right? and the wildlife cameras will actually give us data on that too, right? Will give us data on human presence. So we'll just take that as it comes. We're not expecting that to be a big issue, but you don't know.
And the goal is for people who want to see the wildlife overpass that there may actually be an opportunity to do that off of Oregon 99. There'll be a little overlook where you can see it without actually standing on it.
That's a great point. There, the old highway that runs through there, and it actually curves back from the Mount Ashland exit to just north of the California border. There's several great overlooks, and ODOT's talking about a kiosk and identifying a couple of those sites and having some little telescopes or binoculars that you could kind of zoom in. So yeah, that's a good point.
What other wildlife crossings have been built elsewhere? I'm thinking of Southern California, I suspect something. And what have you learned from how those change wildlife?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, Oregon is a little bit behind a lot of Western states in terms of large wildlife overcrossings. Nevada, I-80 in the eastern part of the state, there's a couple of big overcrossings for deer migration. Wyoming has some for pronghorn antelope. In Washington, Western Washington, there's a big one over I-90. And I think that's largely an elk. So that's, we're early in this whole process. So I think there's a real learning curve, and hopefully there's good knowledge that's shared among all of these. But yeah, Oregon, we've got some undercrossings under US 97, and ODFW and ODOT are trying to create more over and undercrossings as US 97 is improved and expanded into a divided highway as it moves south. So there's certainly opportunities I think state of Oregon's going to take advantage of, but it'll be a learning process, I think. Sure.
So Wallace Edinburgh costs 96 million. This one we're estimating 28 million. Is that just size? Mainly, is that so many more lanes?
Yeah, that Wallace Annenberg, what it goes over.
I think 12 lanes.
It's some crazy thing. Yeah, there's lanes on 101 each direction, and then there's a kind of a fairly big access road that's kind of running parallel to it. So it's got to cross all of that, and it's a big, huge structure. Yeah. In fact, you can follow that on, I think, a couple of Caltrans websites. Yeah, see how they're doing. Yeah, kind of cool. Good point.
Do you expect or imagine there to be increased predation at these bottleneck points?
Yeah.
That'd be
We've been wondering about that, honestly, because certainly there are sit and wait predators that might figure out, hey, this is a good place to sit and wait, and animals are going to come to me. Interestingly, even though that makes sense in theory, in my conversations with other people monitoring overpasses and underpasses, which I'm starting to have, trying to benefit from their knowledge, I haven't heard a lot of accounts of that. For example, I think in many years on Oregon 97, they've had one predation event in one of their crossing structures. So we'll need to wait and see. Certainly, we want a balanced ecosystem.
It's something you think about every time you walk through one of those culverts, or what might be waiting at the other end. They're kind of easy ambush spots, but of course there aren't a lot of ungulates using those culverts, right? They want really big open areas. So the bear was kind of amazing to go through the one culvert, but deer and elk are not gonna. I think we had one, didn't we have one, or maybe Charlie had one fawn that kind of dashed into.
And then came back
That's
out.
the only.
We've had a couple times we've seen mountain lions kind of peek in, or like a coyote kind of go to the entrance, but we haven't seen any predators actually camped out at the entrance to one of those. Yeah. Danny?
Yeah, we got some kind of maintenance themed questions, which I'll couple together. Will there be funding for future maintenance, weeding, cleaning? Also, where there'll be water or irrigation used for the landscape or the animals?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly the irrigation for the plantings, that we didn't talk about that, but there's a lot of seed collection that'll have to happen or is happening. Plant propagation, irrigation of those plants. I'm not sure. ODOT has a kind of a habitat and landscape subgroup that's working on some of those questions and the irrigation schemes. And I think they've developed an idea where they can have a water storage tank actually up on that old Highway 99 to use as a flow down to irrigate some of the plants. So yeah, that's an issue.
Okay, you've had your hand up a while.
I found it interesting that the biodiversity is on the south side of the summit.
Yeah.
It seems like intuitively that high elevation land bridge, through the Siskiyou summit would be the top of the bridge, the place where
Yeah.
So I guess two questions. One, do we know why it's on the south? And then the second question is there more plant diversity in that corridor on the south as well? I mean, yes.
Yeah, I have a couple of theories about this. Theories at this point. Yeah, the north side is more continuously forested, and we see a lot more of those kind of forest-dependent animals showing up there. It's also a little closer to urban development and things like that. So think about just a little bit more impact in the landscape than you might see on the other side. And I think the south side is patchier. It's a little bit more heterogeneous. You have patches of forests, you have patches of grassland, you have oak savannas, you have wetter meadows, and you have a lot of riparian corridors. And so you have lots of different vegetation communities, lots of different habitat and cover that I think can provide for a variety of species. Obviously we see fish are there, and we know that there must be like good den sites there. We see large wildlife like elk and deer there, that especially the elk are going to do well in those more open habitats. But we also see a lot of those more forest-dependent species cropping up there as well, in those riparian areas and patches of forest. So that's kind of my theory about it. Maybe right, maybe not.
Yeah, well, it sounds good to me. And there's also, one of the things that goes into the site selection for wildlife crossing is obviously the integrity of the habitats adjacent to the site. And both Mariposa and actually the Mount Ashland exit have some very good habitats on both sides. That area to the west of Mount Ashland exit, there's a lot of Pacific Forest Trust conservation easement property, and of course Forest Service not too much further. In both areas, there's Southern Oregon Land Conservancy has some easements, and so there's a lot of good quality habitats that, we will think. That's the thing about the Mount Ashland Exide. We see a lot of deer, but, well, why don't we see some other things too? And that's such a wide open area, maybe it discourages some of the animals from crossing there. So maybe we'll be able to fix that, but, we'll learn. We'll learn what works.
I saw your note earlier that after the review process, the estimated cost of the project dropped from like 33 million to 28 million. Do you know what changes they made to drop the cost so much?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Initially, they had proposed to have some prefabricated concrete structures that they would place over the travel lanes and then essentially fill in and build the bridge over it. They found that those were very expensive. They found there was a kind of a steel rib alternative that could be used and could be actually put in place much more quickly than the big concrete arches over the travel lanes. And also by doing that, they found that that you wouldn't have to create crossovers. So one of the things that ODOT was planning, because they didn't want to ever stop traffic on I-5, was that you would have crossovers where you would move, both north and southbound to one side, and then you would switch and work on it, But with this steel ribbing, that they can do slowdowns and not have to construct the crossovers, and the cost of the crossovers was like $1.5 million a piece. So that's $3 million just right there for not constructing that. So, a lot of changes. Also, maybe not having to construct what they call their MSE walls along the structure. You could actually have sloped materials that would support all the soils and vegetation and everything. So just a lot of things that they're looking at that potentially save millions of dollars.
So many hands. I saw yours a little while ago.
After seeing your video that showed the impact of noise on deer, it made me think about, how much noise will there be at this overcrossing? Will that still deter some animals?
Yeah, so one of the big considerations of the design of this overpass is noise and also light. So there'll be these big berms on the side. So there'll still be a sense of openness to the landscape with slopes above in the sky, but there'll actually be big berms that do a lot of noise blocking and light blocking from the highway. And then there'll also be what I think Dan said, about at least 6 feet of fill material covered with topsoil above the bridge structure itself. So it'll have a lot of sound dampening and should be a much, much quieter environment for the animals. Yeah.
Yes.
So I find it fascinating that ODOT, it sounds like it's such receptivity to do this, which is really cool. I like that. And then you mentioned 2.5 miles of fencing, and I'm not understanding what does that mean?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, ODOT has been just a tremendous partner. It's kind of interesting. We approached them. I think Amy kind of contacted the regional manager, just kind of a cold call, and, talked really in the early stages about this. Very interested. Dan Roberts, who's the project manager for ODOT for the Mariposa crossing, as well as the Mount Ashland exit project, been just extremely cooperative, just very eager to explore this, which has just been so wonderful. It's been really good. And you had another part of the question too? The
yeah.
fencing.
Mhm.
You will go ahead and talk.
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of wildlife crossing structures, especially overpasses, the goal is that you're not going to only capture the animals trying to cross the highway at that location, but animals trying to cross the highway anywhere nearby. So that if an animal moves towards the highway, they're going to hit a fence instead of running into the highway. And once they run into that fence, that there will be some fairly reasonable distance they could walk along the fence to find a place to cross. So of course, if an animal walks until it runs into that fence and it turns the right direction, it'll find the overpass or one of our culverts. If it turns the wrong direction, it'll pop out in either California or the Siskiyou Summit. But the goal is that the ends of those will be integrated with landscape features that discourage them from crossing the road. And then again, those fences from the side away from the highway should be really hard for wildlife to get over. So think of like a deer-proof fence at least, or taller. but with those jump outs on the highway side so that any animals that accidentally get stuck, because the last thing you want is for a fence to put an animal in an unsafe situation, right? That they'll be able to use those jump outs to get to the safe side.
We also, by the way, have a really good, one of our coalition members, Oregon Hunters Association, and they actually have groups that monitor the fencing. And so that'll be really good. And, you know, if it's a major problem, ODOT has to fix it, obviously, but, you know, trees tend to fall over, maybe a line breaks or whatever, and so they can actually help repair that sort of thing.
Correction.
On both sides, yep. So 10 miles of fencing.
Yeah, yep, a lot of fencing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if you could just tell us real quickly, what are some of the simple design improvements for culverts?
Mhm.
For
Yeah.
wildlife? Like maybe raising away, not be in the flood area?
Yeah, there's some, you know, we've got mostly small culverts, so I don't have a lot of hope that we'll be able to improve the ones we have. Sometimes with bigger culverts, they can put in like a little bench along the side so that there's a flatter raised walking surface for smaller animals, or they can replace the bottom instead of that curved metal with something more natural. But I think the opportunity is really like if a culvert has to be replaced for some reason, that could potentially be replaced with something that's a little bit more of like a natural design with some raised features.
Yeah, sort of an archway type thing that might have a more natural substrates at the bottom, but would still have that kind of culvert approach to it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yep, good question.
Got a couple more here online. This is a study-based question. How do you propose to correct for aspect, elevation, and habitat differences between the two sites for your Backy experiment? I think it's
Oh gosh, yeah.
absolutely.
Very good question. We've got a lot of work to do on that. Honestly, with all of these, this year has been quite exciting the last 6 months with realizing that we're actually going to have things happen. And so I've started reaching out to other scientists who've worked in this field more to ask for some experimental design review. And that's honestly what I'll be working on this summer. So I don't necessarily have an answer yet, but I'm thinking about it.
Don't look at me. I certainly don't have any.
And I'll say one thing about Backy designs that's really nice is you're comparing the difference between before and after. And so you can look at the difference between before and after in the impact area, and the difference between before and after in the control area. And that provides some of the correction factor itself, essentially.
A few more. Any chance a live feed could be set up for people to watch from their computers?
Yeah. Yeah, we've talked about that as well. And yeah, that's a possibility. You know, I don't know if ODOT has that in their, you know, in their construction budget, but we've talked about that.
Yeah. And we've discussed with ODOT, for example, maybe using cellular enabled cameras on the bridge. So we're getting like real-time updates, for example. We still have to figure that out. Aaron.
When do we find out if it's gonna be 2026 or 2027?
Yeah, you know, so ODOT is just, so they've got, you know, you can appreciate intergovernmental agreements with federal highways. They have to kind of complete before they can actually start utilizing the money. And so they're in that phase. And you know, the last time, at least I talked to ODOT, they were thinking it might be 26 or it might be 27. They just didn't know how fast they could get the money or how much faster they could do the steel rib version versus the concrete precast concrete arch kind of version. So there were just some variables in contracting and that sort of thing that they weren't sure about. But the actual construction process or the construction season is probably fairly short, just maybe a, you know, season. So we're talking about small number of months. And of course, a lot of the plantings and a lot of the, you know, habitat work is a longer duration, but the actual construction is probably just an order of 3 or 4 months.
The revegetation process that happened here earlier than anticipated, it can be left like unvegetated for a little while.
That's a very good question. And you know, that's something that has to go into the equation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a good point because it takes time to grow enough plants for the overpass. And I know that that's something Dan and the committee are working on, but yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, along those lines, someone's asking, will there be opportunities for pollinator groups to work to provide plantings and people power for planting the overpass, such as Pollinator Project Road Valley?
Good question. I'm not sure if you remember off the top of your head. I know that we have several groups involved in that habitat and planting subcommittee.
Yeah, some of them are pollinator kind of groups, Understory Initiative, and they're very concerned about pollinators. I'm not sure if there will be any opportunities for kind of community science, community, in terms of doing any of that work. That might be difficult for ODOT to be able to pull off. So I'm not sure about that. Cool. Well, thank you all very much. We really appreciate it.